Environmental education in practice. As different weather patterns manifest themselves in different ways, schools will differ in their approaches to climate change and disaster risk reduction. What does this mean? It simply means that schools located in an area where there is drought, dryness, very little rainfall, versus schools where there is heavy rainfall, then the schools will need to adjust to those environmental factors because they are not the same. So all schools cannot be treated the same. All schools do not necessarily have to have the same structure. Even the building structure will need to be different if we want schools to survive under the different environmental conditions that they are present in. Communities in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, respond to lack of water and frequent droughts, while Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities cope primarily with floods and contaminated water. So you see, two different geographical locations, two different environmental factors, climate change factors. One, drought, no water. The other, plenty of water, and when floods happen and water stagnates, water contamination makes it worse. And so the schools in these locations would have to deal with the young people differently, and even school building structures in sub-Saharan Africa versus Bangladesh and Pakistan will need to be different. How are they going to be different? What is the difference in the structures that is needed? All that needs to be worked out, talked about with young people involved. Regardless of how climate change is manifested, mitigation and adaptation are two complementary strategies that reduce risk and strengthen affected communities. So climate change will happen, whether it's dry or whether it's wet. But climate change is there. Two things that help. Mitigation is reducing it, and adaptation is adapting, working with that. How do you work? As I said, every summer the monsoon is going to come. How do you adapt to that? How do you reduce the risk of flooding? How do you reduce the risk of contamination through stagnant pools of water? What do you do? All this needs to be thrashed out, talked about, and discussed so that young people begin to also understand and can give their input so that the risk is reduced. Mitigation covers all actions to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. For example, so if you're looking at the greenhouse gases, how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Where do these come from? From vehicles. They come from factories. They even come from homes, depending on, what kind of fuel you use and all that. So how do we reduce that? How do we reduce these kinds of gas emissions so that the greenhouse effect is decreased? Adaptation changes natural and human systems to minimize the risks faced by vulnerable populations. When these gases are released, it not only affects the greenhouse effect, but it also affects the health of individuals, particularly young children and the elderly, because they are the most vulnerable. So, if we can minimize risks to human health, that is adaptation. We adapt ourselves in a similar environment and reduce the risk that it brings to us personally. Based on context, both mitigation and adaptation should be incorporated within environment-friendly schools. Now, all environment-friendly schools work in context. An environment-friendly school in place A may not do the same thing as a similar environment-friendly school in place B. Why? Because the contexts are different. Simply, one school may be in a rural area, one school may be in an urban area. How does this work? They're not the same. And so, if they're not the same, the contexts are different, and therefore the workings will be different. How you mitigate, how you reduce, how you adapt, all those things will be different. Therefore, you see, these decisions cannot be made by some policymakers sitting in an office. These decisions need to be made with young people involved at the site, in the community, in society, where we believe in our young people and listen to them and hear what they have to say. And sometimes they say things that many adults would not even think of, because they have a totally different understanding from their perspective of what these issues are. So we must learn to believe and let our children take risks, and then we need to take the risks by taking in what our young people are saying and trying to see if the solution is actually plausible.